I had to laugh a little bit listening to that clip where the controller says you can't handle a 4 knot tailwind on a 10,000 foot runway.
This topic, Pat, reminds me of Doug Corrigan, 1938, although it has nothing to do with Doug Corrigan, 1938. And I will remind you, because I don't know, maybe you guys went to high school together, but Doug Corrigan is famously known as Wrong Way Corrigan. He was
Wrong
a
way, Corrigan.
Californian. I'm
Yeah.
sorry?
Wrong way, Corrigan. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a Californian. He'd gone out to New York and he wanted to fly across the Atlantic to Europe and he couldn't get permission to do it. And I respect him for this. He said, okay, if I can't do it, I can't do it. I guess I'll go home. And he took off and swore for his entire life he just misread the compass. And he flew east instead of west, ended up in Europe, became a huge sensation. They made a movie about him and everything.
Yeah.
It was the defining moment of his life. But the reason this reminds me of that is we're taught as pilots to take off and land into the wind. Always take off and land into the wind. And that is not true. There are circumstances where you should be landing downwind. And I think it's worth us talking about it.
I think so too.
You know, there's my airport here, Winter Haven, Florida, has a preferred runway. We have 2 runways, 523, 1129, and they all work perfectly fine, but there's a reason that they have a preferred runway, and it's because of the way the traffic flows. We have a seaplane base co-located with the airport. It's literally right next door on a lake. Using the preferred runway takes you away from that traffic. It also puts you over an area as you take off where there's plenty of fields to go to should you have a power failure, rather than going the other way where you're going to be over a developed area and there's really no place to go. But there are flight schools and there are instructors who absolutely will not let a student fly a downwind takeoff or landing. And I think that's pretty close to criminal.
I don't know if I'd go quite that far, but it certainly does put the instructor, if this is a flight school policy, it puts the instructor in a potentially uncomfortable situation. Certainly puts the student in an uncomfortable situation if he or she is approaching an airport with a preferred runway that has a slight tailwind. So I wouldn't go so far as to say it's criminal, but it isn't teaching the student to use all the tools that are available. I'll put it that way.
Well, and there are legitimate reasons to teach this, in all honesty.
Course.
For example, I live on a sandbar. I mean, I'm like 6.5 inches above sea level. It's just the way it is here. But if I was in a high density altitude environment and I'm taking off, I'm going to use a lot more runway than I would here in Florida. And I'm going to be at a higher speed when I leave. Airspeed is going to be the same, but the ground speed will be higher.
Yeah.
Same thing on landing. I'll have a higher ground speed than I normally would, which might weird me out. But if I have practiced downwind takeoffs and landings, and I'm talking about with 2, 3, 4 knots of wind, I'm not talking about 10.
Right.
But less than 5. And that's typically what you see with a preferred runway, and even in a controlled environment, if the winds are below 5, you may get a downwind takeoff or landing. That's one of those things where that skill correlates to a real world environment that a student in Florida will never encounter, but they will when they go elsewhere.
You know, you were talking about your airport. My home airport as well, West Houston, has a preferred runway. It's runway 15. And the standard operating procedure there is for tailwinds less than 5 knots. That's the one that we use. And the reason for that is that we have a rather dense residential area to the north of the airport. And just trying to fly friendly, keeping airplanes from taking off at full power and making a lot of noise over the neighborhood. There's also a slightly non-standard traffic pattern a departure leg if we're taking off to the north, just for the same reason, to fly friendly and keep the noise away from the airport. But But that's the reason that we typically land to the south if we have a slight tailwind. Um, Same thing with my glider club. 1836 is the runway. And again, pretty standard operating procedure there is we take off to the south because there's a lot more places to go in the event of a rope break or an engine issue with the tow plane or whatever. And we'll routinely operate with a no more than about a 5 knot tailwind. Anything above that, now you begin to potentially run into some issues, but it's a skill set that we all need to have.
Well, and you've got a preferred runway at your airport, 1-5, and you're a non-towered airport. I have a preferred runway at my airport, 5, and it's a non-towered airport. This is not an uncommon thing, and you're relating it to a noise abatement procedure. Actually makes sense because sometimes that's part of the reason. But this is common at non-towered airports. But the situation is also common and possible at a towered airport. Pat, let me just prove this point. Take a moment. Listen to this.
Melbourne Tower, November 642, Foxtrot Tango, 14 miles to the west, information Alpha.
642, Coach, I'm just going to call you Fit 42, your VFR. Make straight into 9 right, report over the interstate.
Fit 42 is unable to accept the tailwind on 9 right, so we get 27 or 23.
You can't take a 4-knot tailwind with a 10,000-foot runway?
Negative per SOP, we're not able to take any tailwind until we have our commercial for 642 Foxtrot Tango.
Well, I advise you go to another airport then. I can't turn the operation around until this air carrier lands.
So a situation might be, and this is very common, winds are light and variable in the morning, and they're shifting around, and they're under 5 knots. So the tower just establishes the method that we're going to be getting people in and out. This is the way the pattern is going. And what they're talking about in that audio is we have an airliner coming in, and it's flying to the east, and then we have somebody else saying, I need you to turn the pattern around for me. That adds complexity and problems and the possibility of chaos. And you've got people setting up for the landing they heard they were going to be getting, and now you're asking for something else. You really do have to be prepared to fly the airplane safely and competently given the situation. And it's okay to tell ATC unable. But as happened in this case, the response might be, well, go someplace else then.
Yeah, we have 2 towers that are actually 3 that are towered airports that are really close to West Houston, all of which I do check rides out of. And it isn't uncommon at all to have a very slight quartering tailwind on the active runway. It's just not uncommon at all. And these are all 3 very, very busy airports that aren't simply going to turn the traffic pattern around because the wind happened to switch a little bit and favor the other runway for about 3 nanoseconds. Oops, we got to go back to 3.6. Oops, we're going back to 1.8. That's just not going to happen. It's as you said, it's chaotic, and it's actually a safety issue too.
It is a safety issue, and especially at the non-towered airport where sometimes people overestimate their own importance. And say we're using runway 5 at my airport and the local traffic is used to it. It's in the notes for the airport that's the runway to use. There are signs at the approach end of each runway telling you that you should be using runway 5 if the winds are less than 5. And Pat Brown comes along and says, well, I don't want to land with a tailwind. I'm going to use 2-3. Now we have a truly dangerous situation. Yeah. Where we've got locals and transients who are using one runway, and somebody else comes along and says, well, I'm going in the opposite direction. So opposite pattern, opposite direction on the runway. The likelihood of conflict goes way up. And even if not, the confusion factor can cause people to break off their pattern. And now you just have chaos in the air. It really is important, I think, when you deal with your flight instructor, when you do your flight review, let's try a downwind takeoff or landing if it's appropriate under the conditions and if you're on a runway that allows for that.
I had to laugh a little bit listening to that clip where the controller says you can't handle a 4-knot tailwind on a 10,000-foot runway.
Yeah, I think I could squeeze it in.
It just made me laugh. I know he wasn't trying to be funny, but it was just like, oh yeah, that's
Oh, he
funny.
was incredulous.
Yeah,
He clearly was like, "You've got to be kidding me.
yeah,
There's an airliner in front of
yeah,
you that's dealing with
yeah.
this."
But here's a situation again. It, here we have a flight school. I don't know which one. I don't think it was clear there as to which one, and it really doesn't matter. But it's
Hmm.
probably safe to say it's a big one, and here they are basically handcuffing their instructors. They may. I mean, who knows? It may be an insurance thing. We have a couple of
I'm
flights.
willing to bet it is.
Yeah,
I would put money on this is an insurance thing. This is not a flight training thing.
yeah. We have a one of the airports here where I do a lot of check rides. We have a I don't know, a 7,000 foot runway, and we have it's about a 3,500 or 3,000 foot runway. I've forgotten the links. But the little runway is about, I don't know, 40 feet wide, maybe. The big one is 75 or 100. And there are flight schools that prohibit their students from landing on the little runway solo. And again, I don't know if it's an insurance thing or whether they're afraid, or whether the flight schools are afraid it could become an insurance thing if they allow that. So I get it. I really do. It's the same reason that most flight schools don't allow their flight school airplanes to land on grass or on an unimproved
Hmm.
field. But I get it. I do. It's an insurance thing, and probably, and it perhaps does put the airplane and the student and the instructor um, in an unacceptable risk category. But I come back to there are acceptable risks and there are unacceptable risks, and 3 or 4 or 5 knot tailwind under the right circumstances with appropriate runway and so on and so forth is certainly not an unacceptable risk.
Well, and you and I have both signed off a fair number of
Yeah,
solos in our life.
yeah,
And it's absolutely normal to say, I'm signing you off for solo, but here's your maximum winds. Here's your maximum crosswind component. Here's the ceiling and visibility I want to see. And then you can go solo. That's reasonable. And having a CFI or a flight school establish limits makes all the sense in the world. But this is why I say it's almost criminal earlier. And I will stand by that, even though the great Pat Brown disagrees with me.
no, no, no,
Are you
no.
really being taught to be a safe, competent pilot? Or are you being trained to meet the absolute minimum standards that allow you to pass the test? Frankly, I would rather teach somebody more than is necessary to give them some real skills, because someday something's going to happen in that airplane. Maybe they're flying along someplace and have an engine failure, and there's a runway right over there, but I'm going to be landing with a tailwind. Well, it would suck if that's the first time you've ever done that.
Yeah.
So I really believe in actually training people for the real world they're going to go into. What say you, Pat
Well,
Brown?
I do agree with you. I really do agree with you. And it makes it.
Can we get a little plaque made that on this date Pat Brown agreed with
You can
Jamie
you can
Beckett?
have you can make anything you want, Jamie. I'll hold up a piece of paper on the next one that said I agreed with Jamie on the last one. Um, but here's another dilemma. I'm doing a check ride with an applicant, and it happens to be that the runway in use has a slight tailwind. Now what are we
Yeah.
going to do? They've been trained all their entire training that they can't take off with a tailwind. Yet the runway at use at the airport, towered or otherwise, has a slight tailwind. What's the applicant going to do? Now that applicant has really got the pressure on them because they've been taught, rightly or wrongly, never take off and land with a tailwind. And now they've got an examiner sitting across the table from them, and it's a clear and beautiful day outside.
That is that's a fantastic example I hadn't even thought of. That audio we just heard where the pilot says, my SOPs don't allow it. And that's a private pilot, but what if it was an applicant on a check ride? What if you're shooting the approach and the examiner's like, yeah, make it a full stop? Are you going to say during the approach, well, I can't because there's a tailwind here? You're exactly right. There is a real world application for this skill. And I do think it's incumbent on flight schools and instructors to teach that skill. And if they're not going to, I think they have to tell you up front, I'm going to train you to the minimum standards the ACS sets out. And maybe that's good enough for you. Frankly, it's not good enough for me because real life sometimes exceeds the ACS.
It can often exceed the ACS.
Pat, I can't thank you enough for talking about this issue because it is one that really does weigh on my mind. This is the kind of thing that, as this audio, it's a 10,000 foot runway. You're not going to have a problem putting it down with a 4-knot tailwind. The difference between being upwind and downwind is 8 knots. Right. That's not going to change anybody's life dramatically. It's just going to be an interesting training experience. Yeah. But, you know, that can, as we said, become a real safety issue. And it seems like, oh, no, it's no big deal. We always take off and land into the wind. No, we really don't. We usually do. We often do. That's our goal. But circumstances are circumstances, and we're all going to have to learn to deal with it.
That's right. It becomes a judgment call at the end of the day. It really does become a judgment call.
I believe once again, Pat, we have saved American pilots, even international pilots, because as you know, there are people watching us all over the world, which is a little creepy, but I appreciate it. I
love
like it. I'm going to have to suggest again, people click the like button, share this video on social media because an awful lot of people don't realize what a problem this is and that it needs to be resolved. And of course, subscribe to the channel because it's growing and it makes us happy. And I'd like to think it makes you all happy. Pat, what more can we say?
Nothing.
I'll see you next time, buddy. Thanks so much.